Okay, good morning. So in this session on how to build a global architecture for data, we have 4 speakers, and we're going to go in the following order: Bob Fay of CG, then Johannes Fritz, then Lynn. I'm blowing this because I don't have her last name in front of me. Okay, and then Charisma Banga. And so each of our speakers is going to speak for approximately 5 to 7 minutes. And then we're going to open the floor up to your questions. And if you don't mind, if you could put your questions not in the chat, but on the WTO site, that would be great. So Bob Fay, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. And I'm very pleased to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues, and I'd like to thank the WTO for allowing us to present our ideas on how to construct a global governance architecture for digital trade. So I'm going to make 3 points. First, data, which is at the heart of digital technologies, raises very important and difficult policy issues in areas that go well beyond trade. Second, the current governance arrangements over these critical areas that underpin cross-border data flows are, in my opinion, incoherent. They're fragmented nationally and internationally, where they even exist. So third, how do we deal with this? Well, at my organization, CG, we proposed a new Bretton Woods institution to bring international coherence to these, what I call behind the border issues. So let me go through these points very briefly. So first, data raises very difficult policy issues. So data and cross-border data flows have very profound implications for our respective countries that go well beyond traditional notions of digital trade, especially when digital trade is viewed through what I would say the rather narrow lens of e-commerce. And as even people like Susan, our moderator, pointed out, most cross-border data flows are not related to a good or a service. But these data flows can be turned into information and knowledge and actions. And they feed into advanced analytics, such as machine learning, and they drive digital platforms. So the implications are vast, they're complicated, and they affect many policy areas. And these include data, AI governance, competition, consumer protection, privacy, intellectual property, and as we've seen, even democracy and freedom of expression. So virtually everything is touched by data nowadays. So turning to my second point. So why is it so difficult to get coherence on the governance of these data flows? Well, quite simply because they're associated with vested regional, country, and company interests. And there's fundamental differing values and competing notions around the regulation of data. And you've undoubtedly heard about the data realms, China, US, EU, which the values underpinning the regulations in those countries or jurisdictions are very, very different. And then relatedly, there's what I call this classic insider-outsider dynamics at play. Most people or countries don't even have a voice at the table on what is decided within those realms, nor how they're going to be affected by those decisions. Yet at the same time, they're forced to pick the rules of one of those realms in which to be compliant. And this is particularly true for developing countries. And a little plug for UNCTAD, that's going to release their digital economy report tomorrow. And it's going to delve into some of these issues. So, what do we need? Well, we need a comprehensive and coherent assessment of the risks, the vulnerabilities, and the outcomes of these digital business models. And we need to ensure that the data and digital technologies benefit all and minimize risks. And much of this must be developed through parallel processes outside the WTO and then fed into WTO deliberations. And more generally, but importantly, given that the uses of data can undermine fundamental human rights, we urgently need to create a comprehensive framework for the governance of data and its uses. So my third point, what do we do? So at CG, we promoted something we call a digital stability board. And this is to bring this international coherence to global rules of the game. And virtually everyone is calling for these now. And there's a lot of really good initiatives underway, in the private sector, public sector, civil society, but we need a way to bring them all together. And the Digital Stability Board is a way to do it. And it draws from an organization that was created in essentially the heart of the great financial crisis, the Financial Stability Board, that was established by the G20 to promote reform of international financial regulation. And this organization, the FSB, it's not treaty-based, but it has delivered and managed this vast reform process against, I would say, a lot of vested interests and challenges. I don't think it was an easy process, but its success really draws, from my opinion, from its transparent, its multi-stakeholder international forums that include policymakers, regulators, standard-setting bodies, and civil society. So the DSB, the Digital Stability Board, would be very similar, be a multi-stakeholder forum with a mandate to cover policies, principles, regulations, standards, and legislation across what I refer to as the big data value chain. That's data, artificial intelligence, and platforms, but still allowing that national variation to reflect different values and cultures. So, more specifically, it would coordinate the development of these standards and regulations. It would monitor developments and advise on best practices. It would assess vulnerabilities arising from these technologies. And then, importantly, it would ensure that all of this work feeds into other organizations, such as the WTO, which needs to modernize trade rules to reflect big data. And then, importantly, it would ensure that civil society, developing countries are represented in those discussions, essentially multi-stakeholder driven. So, to finish, this Digital Stability Board, the idea is to build trust in how data are being used that would help to facilitate cross-border data flows that in turn would boost trade and prosperity. And it would help to give certainty in the rules around the uses of data from which all of us would benefit. And ultimately, this would help the WTO achieve its objective to help its members use trade as a way to raise living standards and improve people's lives. So I'll end there, pass it on to my colleagues, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. And I should have mentioned that Bob is the director of the Digital Economy Program at the Center for International Governance Innovation, which is based in Canada. Okay, our next speaker is Johannes Fritz, who is the CEO of St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade. Ready, Johannes?
Yes, I am. Hello, welcome. Good afternoon from me. My name is Johannes Fritz. I want to speak in my opening remarks about what this architecture that we are discussing today could fit, or what it should fit. I represent a new initiative called the Digital Policy Alert. We have launched an independent tracking of policies and regulations affecting the digital economy earlier this year in April 2021. And we do this to understand really what the breadth of the activity is. So we have launched it for the G20, and we have already documented in these few months that we are active for 2021 alone, 500 and more changes that affect the digital economy. You see it on the right-hand side where these are roughly located. The shading reflects a darker tone is a more active jurisdiction. A lighter tone is a less active one, at least according to our monitoring. And so 500 is a lot, but we also have a lot to cover. So when we designed the Digital Policy Alert last year, we wanted to cast a very, very wide net. We cover many policy domains ranging from data governance to content moderation, but also competition, as already mentioned, is an important topic, intellectual property, of course, and taxation coming to the fore as well. We go beyond that also to include operation conditions and other things. really the ambition here is to describe or to capture the activity in this space as wide as possible to really present an adequate picture of what's going on in the regulation of the digital economy. To do that, we also have to step out of our classic monitoring. The Digital Policy Alert is the little sibling of the Global Trade Alert, which has been around for 12 years. In the Digital Policy Alert, we go through all branches of government. So we have the executive, we have the legislator, and in some cases also the judiciary, mainly for case law, as you know. Case law is very active and can also be seen as one of the shapers of the environment that the digital economy globally is facing. And to be an activity tracker, we want to see proposed and adopted changes. So we are tracking them from the first proposal by an official body going all the way to their either a revocation or implementation. The theory behind going so wide is that the regulation of the digital economy really is just emerging. We are treating here an object that is relatively novel and is moving very fast, as we all know. And so we are, as policymakers or regulators, we are hardly aware of the trade-offs we are facing, the unintended consequences that we may have. And so really going wide and trying to see what countries are doing and being able to create a detailed map really to base a benchmarking on, to provide comparisons from, is what the Digital Policy Alert is doing right now as an activity tracker. And that's what I want to bring today. In the future, we're also going to speak more to fragmentation by really trying to dissect what the differences are between different policies. So what is it that right now, from looking just at 2021, that the digital policy, that the global governance architecture should encompass? And I'm obviously agreeing here very strongly with Bob, and I'm sure other panelists as well, that that we are seeing data at the center. So if I look at what has happened over this year, what we have documented, data governance by far is the most active field. Unsurprisingly, data protection regulation, be it implementations of bits in Europe or stemming from the GDPR, other countries following suit with similar regulations, or completely own initiatives like the Chinese private information protection law that was recently adopted. So data governance has a lot of action going on, not least also because of these recent cybersecurity incidents that led regulators to ask around for input on how to set basic standards in this area. And it's also that activity is picking up. But another important issue that we see is competition, and Bob already mentioned it here. It's really the way the main we know from news is case decisions on unilateral conduct, market dominance, or merger control that we have seen. But there's also innovation in the legislature per se, in the law, for instance, that there is emerging ex ante inquiries that may to be ahead of, say, a digital monopoly, try to investigate a big company beforehand, before that monopoly is actually asserted. So an ex ante approach, we have seen also the definition of what constitutes a market is obviously particularly dicey in the digital domain, where the market is principally global. And we have seen movement around that area. And then third is probably one also what we see a lot in the media is content regulation. So how to treat access to platforms, how to require platforms to disclose how they are monitoring and filtering their content. And then also very important for us, I think, is the emergence of intermediate liability, so that you as a platform are liable for content your users are posting. That's not just IP related, so that they're infringing some other person's copyright, but they may be engaging in either illegal speech or hate speech, and you then, or harmful speech, I'm sorry, and you as the platform face consequences for transmitting said information. Finally, the last two I have on with me today that I think we could also address in a global architecture, or should think about, is the operating conditions, which are usually driven by some national interest concerns. So service access restriction is, for instance, the blocking of TikTok that has been in the media, or other apps that usually are prohibited for some national security concerns, similar with the entry and ownership rules from multinational enterprises, that they are not prohibited, that they are prohibited to acquire, say, a sensitive AI company, because they're worried that such information intelligence could be used against the national interest of the home country for the target. And finally, taxation is always coming to the fore. It's also, there's two ways it is addressed. Usually we talk about digital service taxes, that the revenue of a company is trying to be taxed where it is accrued. So the revenue of an American tech firm that's generated in Canada is taxed in Canada, for instance. There is an initiative for that, but the countries leading the way on that area is obviously the Europeans that have started to legislate in that direction. As for indirect taxes, VAT on e-commerce, we know it's the Europeans have revisited their approach to that. Also in the European and the US states, we see a lot of activity about how to include VAT e-commerce trades in the value-added tax system there. So we see, these 5 different buckets, and going into this discussion about how a global architecture could fit that, I draw on work from Kati Suominen, who looked at FTAs recently, at recent FTAs, and just looked at their main building blocks that they have that relate to the digital economy. And so she, in her recent paper, drew out certain features from the most recent trade agreements we are dealing with. So there's the DPA that we're going to hear more about certainly on the right-hand side, but basically over the last couple of years, we have seen a series of trade agreements that speak to the digital domain. So as you can see from the left-hand side, the main topics I've identified before are in there somewhere. Obviously, there's also a huge competition component usually in these, or several sections in these FTAs. But if you can see it in the more detail, right now, the data governance side, we're speaking more towards data localization, transfer of data, which are very, very important issues. But especially what we may be able to discuss later on is issues like privacy and liability from data protection is issues that I think are also very, very important in the area of data governance. With that, where the activity is at and what we have to build on in terms of the FTAs, I want to close for now and hand it back to Susan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johannes. Excellent entree onto Leyland Tan, who is the Director of International Trade at the Ministry for Trade and Industry in Singapore. And she's going to talk about DPA. Please.
Thanks, Susan. Actually, I'm going to talk about something broader, but maybe during the question and answer, I can take some questions on DPA. So good afternoon, and thank you to the WTO for inviting me to participate in this session on how to construct a global governance architecture for data. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to share my views. Data underpins the new digital economy. COVID-19 has made this even more clear. We have seen data sharing for medical research, contact tracing, adoption of digital services for business continuity. Data and data flows will continue to be more important as more countries and businesses embrace digital transformation. At the same time, the new data uses and business models have given rise to new issues and challenges. For example, access to data, the value of data, data sovereignty, and this has in turn led to a proliferation of data legislation. The operating environment has become more complex, as Johan had highlighted in his earlier presentation. For example, the number of data localization measures enforced around the world has more than doubled in 4 years, from 2017 to 2021. Data is often described as the new oil. We don't think that this analogy or description is quite apt. We see data as a non-rivalrous resource, and it should not be treated as a resource or commodity to be hoarded within national borders. Different countries and different organizations can work on their respective copies of the same data set, each having an opportunity to benefit from it. What we have seen in the recent spate of data localization measures, typically they target specific types of data like personal or health data, or data deemed important or sensitive related to national security. There is this notion that the best way to protect important or sensitive data is to store it within a country's border. There is also this concept that there is a loss of sovereignty if data is located on a foreign cloud service. the way we see is that, data localization requirements actually do not change who is responsible for the data, regardless of where it is stored. Sorry. A breach could happen as easily in country as it could on a foreign cloud without the right safeguards in place. With the pandemic accelerating digitalization, there has perhaps never been a more compelling time for countries to build common standards and principles together to allow data to flow smoothly and safely across borders. We agree there's a need to build a global architecture for data. Hence our efforts at the WTO Joint Statement Initiative for E-commerce and the network of digital economy agreements that Singapore has been negotiating. The aim being to create the building blocks towards a trusted environment for data and digital trade that gives scope for countries to go further. For Singapore, what we see as pivotal is the principle of accountability. So in the context of cross-border data transfer, it manifests as the requirement that a data controller transfer data to an overseas recipient only after being assured that the recipient is able to accord a comparable standard of protection to the data it receives. This accountability principle is also the cornerstone of the APAC privacy framework and its certification systems for accountable cross-border data of personal data. The APAC cross-border privacy rules, CBPR, and the privacy recognition for processes, the PRP systems. In the joint statement initiative on e-commerce, as well as in our digital economy agreements and the e-commerce chapters of our recent FTAs, Singapore's approach is that countries should refrain from restricting cross-border data flows and should not require companies to use or locate computing facilities within the country as a condition for conducting business. This is what we hope to entrench as a global norm. The principle that cross-border transfer of data, be it personal, business, or machine data, should be allowed. Any restrictions imposed should be limited to those necessary to achieve legitimate public policy objective. For us, an example of a public policy objective is the assurance of equivalent protection for personal data transferred across borders. How then should data transfer be facilitated while ensuring comparable protection? One example is the consent on contract, which we think is already part of the global norm for data transfer, and upon which interoperability of global data protection and privacy regimes can be built. One widely known example is the EU standard contractual clauses. In ASEAN, we also have the ASEAN model contractual clauses, recognized by all 10 ASEAN members and ready for use since January this year. Certification is another mechanism to data transfer that we think hold promise as a new norm. A number of countries such as Japan, Singapore, and Republic of Korea have domestic data protection certification system. The APAC CBPR and PRP, which I mentioned earlier, are certification systems for cross-border data transfer. There are currently 9 participating economies, including Singapore, Japan, Chinese Taipei, Republic of Korea, Philippines, and the US. There is a lot of potential in articulating and establishing new norms for digital issues, including data flows. There are currently multiple and overlapping global discussions on digital issues. This takes place across, I think I mentioned, world, APAC, WEF, WTO, UN, and its agencies, and I think even like sort of like private organization, like what Bob is also doing, the digital stability board that you're talking about. We should try to bring this very disparate threads together and consider a global digital architecture to enable all countries to participate meaningfully. In particular, convergence for data flows and data protection, I think, through international rules, frameworks, agreements, and other mechanisms can be key steps that countries take to harness the full potential of the digital economy for all countries, big and small? Thank you.
So thank you so much. Okay, our final speaker is Karishma Banga, who is a research fellow at the Institute for Development Studies in the United Kingdom.
Hello. Thanks, Susan. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session at the WTO Public Forum. So as Susan mentioned, I'm Karishma Banga. I work as a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. And I'm also a digital trade policy advisor at the Commonwealth Business Women Network. So I'm going to take a bit of a different perspective here than what has been previously said on the panel, from the perspective of whether or not we need a global data architecture or whether we should be focusing on a inclusive data architecture. So just to give a bit of an introduction, emerging evidence has shown that the COVID-19 pandemic has directly accelerated e-commerce, with a spike in both business to business and business to consumer e-commerce globally. But the beneficiaries of this has significantly differed across countries. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, it's around 60% of the population in high-income countries that was engaged in online buying. But this was as low as 2 to 5% in low and lower middle income countries. And then it comes as no surprise that a survey of 206 African firms showed that during the COVID-19 pandemic, the e-commerce revenues attained by these firms were relatively quite small, just around 16%, with a lower share in goods than services. And in Africa, e-commerce tends to be very, very concentrated, with just 10 African countries accounting for 94% of all online business on the continent. And this is majority of this e-commerce is domestic, so contained within the national boundaries. And cross-border e-commerce in Africa is limited due to various reasons, including the fact that some transactional platforms have restrictions on the basis of origin of the sellers. So they only allow domestic sellers on their platforms, and only 28% of the marketplaces offer any sort of online payments transactions. Other challenges include analog challenges related to postal competence and delivery, issues around taxation, as well as lack of awareness of national and regional rules and custom duties in Africa. So we're talking of an entirely different context here, and just pointing to the fact that there is a very significant divide when we talk about digital trade, which includes e-commerce, but also electronic transmissions. At this time, what we're seeing is that the current global narrative around digital trade is being heavily shaped by technology companies in high-income countries. So if you look at the graph on the left, this shows that the ICT lobbying in the US was as high as $80 million in the last year in 2020. With the expenditure that some companies, such as Facebook and Amazon, have spent on lobbying, doubling in just 5 years. So you can see a significant spike here. So the lobbying expenditure spent by these firms have doubled in the 5 years. And in total, the market capitalization of the 5 big tech firms, which is Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Facebook, has reached $7.5 trillion by 2020, which is 3 times the nominal GDP of the entire African continent alone. The issues that these tech firms are lobbying for have also expanded beyond just domestic ones to digital trade provisions in trade agreements, seeking free cross-border data flows, bans on data localization and source code sharing, as well as permanent moratorium on custom duties on digital products. But as we've discussed before, there's no consensus at the multilateral level, which is why most of this digital trade agenda is being pushed forward largely through bilateral and regional trade agreements. And critically, the norms that are established in these smaller groupings can strongly influence what we see happening at the multilateral level later, which is why it is so critical to understand what sort of digital trade provisions are featuring in these trade agreements. So some of my work with United Nations Economic Commission for Africa tries to look at that. So we try to look at preferential trade agreements to understand how digital trade provisions feature in them. And here we focus just on South-South trade agreements. And this is largely because, with the exception of China, countries in the global south, including African countries, they face very similar issues in terms of political constraints and contextual constraints to innovation, and also face similar capacity issues. And many of these economies are what we call as digital latecomers. So they're late into this digital industrialization game, and they're trying to catch up or converge with developed countries in the global north. So we think that understanding South-South trade agreements can shed critical insights on what this inclusive data infrastructure looks like. So here we've used the TAPID data set, which is recently launched. It covers around 340 trade agreements, of which 60 trade agreements are between South-South, so between global South countries. So here we find that a minority of these trade agreements, around 32%, include a provision on e-commerce, and around 11% have an e-commerce provision in one of the existing chapters on goods and services. 20% have a dedicated separate chapter on e-commerce. And this is largely because some of the countries are hesitant in taking a stance on what they classify as e-commerce. Because if you classify e-commerce products as goods, then they will be subject to the GATT agreement under WTO. And if you classify electronic transmissions as services, they would be subjected to GATS at the WTO. So to kind of avoid taking an explicit stance, e-commerce in some of these trade agreements has been introduced as a separate chapter, which is in 20% of these 60 South-South trade agreements. But we do see that the importance of digital trade provisions in South-South trade agreements have been evolving over time. So the share of South-South trade agreements which have a digital trade provisions has increased over the last decades, both in terms, also in terms of the number of words in each agreement. And now just coming to the main sort of crux of my presentation. So here we look at the digital trade provisions in South-South trade agreements to kind of understand where the priorities lie for global South countries. And it is quite clear here that the most common provision in South-South trade agreements is on data protection and privacy. So 23% of these South-South trade agreements have a provision related to data protection, which is typically requiring signatory countries to ensure legal protection of personal data or data privacy of any kind. But only 2% of these agreements actually have hard commitments, which are enforceable by law. Majority of them are soft commitments, which are best endeavors or regulatory cooperation activities. And around 15% are mixed commitments. So they have a mixture of both hard and soft commitments that allow for regulatory cooperation activities in this area. The second most common provision that we find is around electronic trade facilitation. So 22% of these agreements have a provision on electronic authentication or digital signatures, and 21% have a provision on consumer protection, including for consumers buying and selling online. When we come to cross-border data flows, here we see that only 12% of these agreements have an e-commerce chapter, which specifies that there should be free cross-border data flows. And of these 7, 2 of them, again, are soft commitments asking for or emphasizing countries working towards sharing of data flows. And when we look at data localization, it is quite clear that in South-South trade agreements, this is actually quite unpopular. So only 8% of the South-South trade agreements have any requirement banning data localization requirements or limiting them, while 92% of these trade agreements have no such provision. So they do allow policy space to developing countries to sort of make their own policies on data localizations, And lastly, in trade negotiations, I think a lot of focus has been on digital taxation and custom duties and whether or not there should be a moratorium on custom duties on digital products. And here, if you look globally, and a lot of the studies say that there is one of the most common provisions is that there should be a ban on custom duties on electronic transmissions. If you look at just South-South trade agreements, again, this is not a very popular provision. Only 15% of these agreements, South-South trade agreements, ask for a ban on custom duties. And this is largely because as we move forward and more products become digitally deliverable, this is going to have significant revenue implications for developing countries. So for instance, if we look at architectural services, a lot of African countries have placed limitations and restrictions on architectural services under their GATS commitments. But if we consider e-commerce to be everything that is traded via Mode 1, then these would also be completely open. So as a result, the South-South countries tend to not make this a very popular provision. And again, if you look at source code sharing here, actually none of the South-South trade agreements ban requirements for source code sharing. And this is quite interesting, I think, because if you just look a couple of years ago, there was this whole controversy around the Amazon Mechanical Turk model, where Amazon's own algorithm was kind of biasing against women sellers on its own platform. So we need access to that sort of source code to be able to figure out where such discrimination is really taking place.
Charisma, I'm sorry to be rude, but you've really gone beyond the time. Could you
wrapping up now? I think this is the last slide. So just very quickly, in addition to what I just discussed, I think when we talk about implementation in Africa, it is quite clear that a regional approach is gaining a lot of traction. And there are also very good examples of regional economic communities that have made progress on a lot of these data governance issues. And I'm also happy to discuss this later in question and answers round, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just end my intervention here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have a bunch of questions, and so let's start with one, beginning with you, related to taxation and whether or not, do you think the e-commerce tax moratorium makes sense for developing countries?
Sorry, is that for me?
Yes, we'll start with you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think this is, one of those contentious topics that different organizations are discussing whether or not there should be a permanent moratorium on custom duties on electronic products. And I think from the developing countries' point of view, there is, if you look at countries like Ghana and Kenya, around 60% of their trade can be digitally deliverable. So for these countries, putting in place, that not being a moratorium on custom duties can have significant revenue implications. So I think this is a very country-specific issue where countries who are better at the sort of digital industrialization game do stand to lose out on significant revenue implications. And I think there are UNCTAD studies as well, kind of putting an estimate on these revenue implications that I can direct you towards.
Would anyone else like to answer that?
Hi, Susan, can I? Actually, I kind of don't really understand this revenue loss for developing countries. So this moratorium is for electronic transmission. So even if you do e-commerce and the end product is a physical product, clearly there will be customs duty collection at the physical borders. So actually we are talking about a moratorium only on electronic transmissions. I just want to clarify that point. So I think when we look at it from the developing countries' perspective, we have to see what is being exported here that we are talking about that leads to revenue loss. So in the case of Singapore, we don't impose customs duty on electronic transmission, but we do impose, what we call the sales and a value-added tax. So that is still revenue for the country. So I think I really, if you look at it in totality, beyond customs duty, which is really quite hard to impose, when you talk about electronic transmissions, I mean, you've thought this through, there are actually other ways of collecting their revenue from the country's perspective. I don't know whether Bob or Johannes have anything to add as well.
I agree with what you just said, Lynn. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to another. Does anyone else want to answer this question?
I mean, more from the point of feasibility, I think it's also the easier approach from part of the government to tax the revenue through a VAT, rather than trying to suss out what data crossed what border for what purpose. So I think if that's what they're doing, I think it's easier to, my assumption would be that a VAT is the way to go forward for that, to raise that revenue.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question which relates to the how we can find common ground on, the questioner defined it as privacy, but let's call it data protection because privacy is really too narrow. So where do you think that'll happen? Because what I'm hearing from everybody is there isn't a shared norms to underpin a shared global architecture. And Bob is saying, let's take it out of the WTO. The DIPA model and other models that Singapore has adopted have a different approach. How can we find flexibility? This is a question for everybody, but let's start with Lynn.
Thanks, Susan. We don't have a sort of like easy answer to this. So what we have sought to do through DIPA is kind of like a building block approach. What we have is this exhortation that you have to take into account principles and guidelines of relevant international organizations when they are developed. And then we also seek to recognize that different countries do take different legal approaches. But can we try to sort of pursue approaches that can promote compatibility and interoperability? So you will see in DIPA, there's kind of like a variety of ways that you can do it, including recognition of regulatory outcomes, broader international frameworks when they are developed, recognition of national trust marks or certification frameworks. So we start with what is already existing. And clearly the end goal is if there's a global norm, that's where we want to target. But we want to start taking steps now. So, this is how DIPA approached it. And then we also have like collaboration, cooperation. Can we look for use cases where there is data sharing that we can do through regulatory sandboxes? So this is the kind of like very flexible, collaborative approach that we are trying to adopt.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to answer that question? Johannes, Charisma?
Yeah, I think just very quickly in my presentation also, as I was mentioning that I think when we talk about in the African context, the regional approach really seems to be gaining traction. And we interviewed around 31 firms, African firms, and what was clearly emerging was that there's significant interest in selling on intra-regional platforms and intra-regional data sharing, and there is interest in sort of creating those data commons regionally. So I think that is one sort of way forward in implementing and harmonizing some of these data laws. And particularly, I think progress is already there in a lot of these things. If you look at ECOWAS, they're already functioning regional data protection framework, and you also have the Northern Corridors Integrated Project, which is where Eastern African countries are sharing their intergovernmental data and have managed to successfully harmonize some of their data laws to facilitate in specific cases their data policies. So I think a regional approach towards implementation, at least in the case of Africa, seems to be a lot more realistic.
When you say realistic, what do you mean? That it's likely to happen, or?
Yes, likely to happen also in terms of the progress that has already been made, because a lot of these countries are, for instance, if you look at the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, a lot of these countries are entering, different parts from Africa, entering the AfCFTA with highly uneven levels and fragmented levels of data protection and governance frameworks. But they are quite far along in terms of their regional economic communities in harmonizing. And they're also a lot less hesitant in terms of the data sharing and data harmonizing when it comes to their regional partners. So this is what we found from the study that we did, surveying African firms, that this approach forward could be a lot more sort of beneficial for these African private sector firms.
I'm going to call you right next. Johannes, you were going to say something, I think? No? Okay.
Hey, I was, but I can let Bob take first, so that's fine.
Go right ahead, Bob. There you go.
Oh, well, I was, okay, thanks. I mean, so to start with, like, I like the digital economy partnership agreement approach. Like, I like the word partnership. I think that's really important. And I like the three countries that are driving it because they span different parts of the globe and I think different values in some respects. And it's, you know, you want to have that conversation. I think, and then of course in Africa, we you know, obviously Krishma's discussed what's happening there. I think it's more, you still want to get that global approach, and how do you do that? And then, you know, on top of it, and if you look at the framework that Johanna showed, when one's talking about data governance, you're also talking about competition. You're also talking about consumer protection. You're also talking about intellectual property. So it's great to have an approach on data governance and data cross-border data flows, but you also, I think, want to have a conversation of the implications in these other areas. And they're very profound. You know, Johannes, once again, he talked about content. That's very, very difficult area, but it's embedded in these conversations. And so, you know, what we're recommending is, you know, obviously this institution that will bring all of these areas to the table and not just look at them in isolation, even though recognizing, you know, an approach forward is to start with, okay, how do we even harmonize cross-border data flows?
That is such an important point, but I've noticed no one here has mentioned public data, which some trade agreements include, that should be provided in an open, machine readable format. And that is key if we want to solve wicked problems. And we hear nothing about that from African countries where public data may not be as open. Johannes?
On public data, I mean, for me, I have a very own interest in this, since that we are tracking government actions, and so we would want to have as much public data as there could possibly be. In terms of the interchange, the automatic interchange, this is beyond our focus. We try to focus on the private sector here and regulate the digital economy, not the government's actions per se. So more transparency in their actions, so we can, you know, read those and make it legible, make it interpretable what governments are doing. That would obviously be a boon, I think, for accountability.
Okay, another question which relates to the meeting tomorrow in Pittsburgh of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. And the questioner asks, you know, what is the meaning of this? And is this a good thing? You know, on one hand, you have real trade agreements at the regional and international level, and then you have this attempt to find a coordinated position. So can everyone comment on that? Bob, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, it's good to see the US and EU talking, obviously. But, you know, when I first heard about this, you know, obviously as a Canadian, I thought, well, how's Canada going to be represented in those discussions? Not clear at all to me. And what's going to be driving US interests? Well, I would naturally expect that the big social media platforms whose headquarters are based in the United States are going to be very influential in those discussions. And so once again, it's good, always good to have you know, regions or countries talking, but the implications that those talks go well beyond those two. And how, you know, how do we get participation of everyone else in something that might come out of that meeting that's going to affect us directly?
Thank you. Would anyone else like to answer this?
Hi,
No?
Susan. Lynn here. I can just give it a go. So actually, like Bob as well, you know, it's good that the two big boys are talking to each other, but it's not clear what the outcomes would be. You know, for Singapore, they are key partners in the joint statement initiative on e-commerce. If they can have a closer understanding on certain issues like data, I think that would be ideal, and that might actually help pave the way towards a landing. I mean, obviously, it's not just these two players. I mean, there are different countries with different approaches as well. But having the two come to a sort of understanding might be a useful bridge. Thank you.
Thank you. Johannes or Charisma?
To me, it's like, I think it would be, with all this activity, I think some coordination already can establish like a benchmark or something that people can work around so it doesn't go in all directions. But I second my colleagues, Bhavin, that a broader, more inclusive forum is certainly appreciated here, even though having a narrow, from two big players, a narrow benchmark is already something to be useful, but a broader forum would be preferable.
Yeah, and just, I would just like to agree with what Bob said as well, that yeah, you are going to see sort of the representation of interest by these big tech firms that I also presented in the slide, that, you do see this really huge spike in ICT lobbying by, the big tech firms over the last 5 or 6 years, and the issues that they're lobbying for have also, clearly expanded. So I think my only hope is that, there doesn't end up being a sort of north-south extrapolation of digital trade rules, and that, it is, as I mentioned, a lot more inclusive. Yeah, so just like a brief remark there.
One of our questioners asked, though, could the end result of that be a patchwork based on regional norms? And how would you reconcile that? Do you want to go first, Rishma?
Could you repeat it, please?
Yeah, so given what you just said, one of our questioners asked, if you have regional norms, how do you reconcile those multilaterally? Since for the digital economy, the free flow of data needs to be some way, I don't want to use the word harmonize, but made compatible among different regions.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think the countries are coming in as, and I think Lei also mentioned here that, there are principles around data localization, there's data sovereignty, which is different. So where you're storing the data, whether it's locally or whether it's, whether you own the data, but it is, stored in some other countries, sort of national boundaries. So I think the countries are entering these regional and continental negotiations as well as global discussions at very varied levels. And so it is, bound to be quite difficult to get this sort of harmonization. I think I also don't like this, use of this word global harmonization of data standards, because clearly that's going to be very difficult to achieve. And I think the key is sort of retaining the policy space here to best suit what is the country's national industrialization agenda. So I think that that is important. So for instance, if you look at China, given its market size, it was able to negotiate, for instance, with companies like IBM, and was able to store its data locally, and was able to get an investment from IBM. Of course, as a single African country might not be able to achieve that because of its limited market size, but regionally or continentally, as a whole continent, the market size is pretty significant. So I think, yeah, I think regional norms can be kind of useful in setting up that position at a more multilateral level in a consolidated manner.
Thank you. Johannes, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I second that the forces for harmonization are quite strong here, especially for a small economy. You don't want to step out of line too far, because else you may have trouble accessing a market, or companies from that market are going to roll out their latest product to your country because they don't want to worry about the compliance issues involved. So I think we are headed for some block split, rather handful, with the US and Europe doing their thing. Obviously, China is not going to follow American US rules very quickly. Same probably for Russia and India. It would be another candidate, as well as Indonesia. And so all those hubs have their own, pulling force, the gravitational force from the smaller countries around them. And so they will have to, they don't have to, but it's going to be tough for those ones to see which block to align with. That said, multilateral coordination would be absolutely critical to keep basics open across those blocks.
Lynn?
Sorry, I kind of agree with what Johan has said. For a small and open economy like Singapore, obviously the international, a global kind of framework always works the best. But we are also pragmatic, and that's why we're actually doing digital economy agreement and see if we can use kind of, like I mentioned, a building block approach. We are hoping that, even if region were to start with regional norms, they would also aspire and work towards global norms eventually as well. Thanks.
Bob, what do you want to give some final comments?
Well, I mean, I agree with what everyone just said, and I think, to repeat where I started, we still got to figure out how to get everyone to the table and have that global discussion, and that's particularly true for the countries that are not involved in those conversations, which is actually the majority of the world's population, I might add.
So we're not ending on a hopeful note. And we have a couple more minutes to summarize where we're at. Would anyone like to make some other final comments?
Maybe I'll come in, because I hate to end on as you say, a not so good note. I mean, as I mentioned, there are so many good initiatives underway. Some of the ones we've heard about today, and there's many, many others. And it's a question of just trying to harmonize them, and the work that Johannes is doing, which is truly a public good, I would say, is really showing just how complicated this is. But as I said, underlying that, there is a lot of really good stuff going on, and I don't think we should lose sight of that. And whether for better or for worse, I think the pandemic has really brought some of these issues to the front, to the fore. And I think now people are starting to say, yeah, we have to do something. So I think the willingness is there. It's just the mechanism to do it.
I would agree with that, but what do you say, Lynn?
I'm very hopeful. That's why we are doing digital economy agreement. I don't know if any of you caught the speech of my Minister of Foreign Affairs at the UNGA. He actually, I think he acknowledged what Charisma was talking about, the digital divide, and he actually offered a package for friends of the small states to have conversations about how can we build up digital capacity building. And for Singapore, we're also doing a virtual roundtable because I think we need the whole world to move along with us. And we have to acknowledge that there is a digital divide. And even in Singapore, I mean, we think this notion of digital inclusion, it's an important one, so we want to get SMEs on board this digital transformation. I think when you can show the benefits to more, perhaps the chances of a global governance for data and for digital rules will be that much greater. Thanks.
Thank you so much. The digital overlords at the WTO have deemed this conversation over. So I want to thank all of you so much for participating. And I hope everybody has a great day. And if you want to learn more about these issues, and I hope you will want to, Johannes's website, Global Trade Alert, is one place you can go. The Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub is another place you can go. There's been a lot of scholarly work. Check it out. Thank you, everyone.